The first thing you should know is this. Humiliation doesn't always arrive quietly. Sometimes it shows up wearing a tuxedo, holding a champagne glass, and smiling while it ruins your life. If you had walked into that restaurant that night, you would have thought everything was perfect. Soft lighting. Crystal glasses. Investors laughing too loudly. A grand opening that screamed success. What you wouldn't have noticed, what no one noticed at first, was the woman standing 3 feet from her husband, realizing in real time that her entire marriage had just expired. "You know what she is?" my husband said, loud enough for the table beside us to hear.
A trophy wife has gotten, Rusty.
The word didn't just land. It cut. Laughter followed, scattered and uneasy, the kind people use when they don't know whether they've witnessed a joke or a warning. My husband, Gregory, stood at the center of the room like a man delivering a punchline he'd practiced in the mirror. He looked proud of himself. Comfortable. Certain. I stood beside him, perfectly styled in the emerald dress he'd chosen for me that morning. Hair just the way he liked it. Smile trained into place. I looked exactly how a successful man's wife was supposed to look. Polished, quiet, decorative.
My name is Joanna.
I was 29 years old. And until that moment, I genuinely believed I was married to someone who loved me. I had helped pay for that restaurant. Funded it, actually. Nearly all of it. But none of that mattered now. In that room, in front of people who barely knew me, my husband had reduced me to an object that had lost its shine. Then he did something worse. Gregory reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. Thick.
White. Formal.
"Well," he said smoothly, "since we're making announcements tonight, I might as well get this out of the way too." He turned toward me, still smiling.
Joanna, sweetheart, I'm filing for divorce.
My lawyer prepared everything last week.
You understand, right?
A man at my level needs someone who can keep up. The room went dead silent.
Not shocked silence. Not sympathetic silence.
The kind of silence that waits to see how badly someone is about to break. I could feel dozens of eyes on me, watching for tears, begging, collapse. They wanted drama with their champagne. They wanted proof that I was exactly what he just called me. They didn't get it. I took the envelope from his hand. Slowly. Carefully. My voice didn't shake when I spoke. "Thank you for telling me," I said. "I appreciate the honesty." His smile faltered. Just for a second. I turned and walked out. My heels echoed across the floor, each step louder than the last. Behind me, Gregory laughed too loudly and tried to restart the party, already rewriting the story in his head.
The valet brought my car around.
I drove home with the divorce papers unopened on the seat beside me, Denver skyline glowing cold and indifferent behind me. I didn't cry in the driveway. I didn't scream. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, replaying one word over and over.
Rusty.
That was the moment something inside me hardened. Because what Gregory didn't understand, what he was about to learn the hard way, was that I wasn't rusted. I was loaded. And I was done being decorative. He thought the story ended the moment I walked out of that restaurant. What he didn't realize was that was only the opening scene. I didn't open the envelope that night. Not because I was afraid of what it said, but because I already knew.
Divorce papers are cold things. Precise. Final.
And I wasn't ready to give Gregory the satisfaction of imagining me curled on the floor, sobbing over legal language he thought would end me. Instead, I sat in my car in the driveway of the house I helped buy, watching the porch light flicker against the windshield. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. My hands were locked around the steering wheel so tightly my fingers ached, but still, no tears. Those would come later. In private. Inside the house, everything looked the same.
The art on the walls.
The furniture chosen to impress guests we barely liked. The silence that had been growing louder for months without me noticing. I placed the envelope on the kitchen counter like it was something fragile, then poured myself a glass of water I didn't drink. The word he used kept circling back.
Rusty.
Like I was something that had once been useful and now wasn't. Like age had crept up on me quietly while I wasn't looking. Like I hadn't just spent the last 3 years building his dream with my money, my time, my intelligence. I was 29 years old. And my husband had already decided I was obsolete. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying moments I'd brushed off before. Meetings I'd stopped being invited to, decisions I'd stopped being asked about, the way Gregory had started talking over me when investors were around. At the time, I told myself it was stress, pressure, success changing him. Now I saw it for what it was. He didn't need me anymore. Or so he thought. By sunrise, the shock had worn off and something else had taken its place. Not rage. Not grief. Focus. The kind that snaps into place when survival instincts wake up. I showered, dressed comfortably for the first time in months, and went straight to the room Gregory never used, my office. The space still smelled faintly of paper and coffee. Financial statements were stacked neatly where I'd left them. A framed photo of my grandmother sat on the desk, her eyes sharp even in old age. She had built everything she owned from nothing, and she taught me one lesson above all others.
Never hand over power without understanding how to take it back.
I opened my laptop. Contract by contract, agreement by agreement. I reviewed every document tied to Gregory's restaurant.
Every wire transfer. Every signature.
Every clause I insisted on, just in case. Even when he laughed and said I was overthinking. And that's when I saw it. My investment wasn't a gift. It wasn't even a partnership. It was a loan. A legally binding, professionally drafted loan. For $2.7 million. Structured with protections. Exit clauses. Timelines. Consequences. Consequences Gregory had never bothered to read. Because he trusted me to never use them. The terms were clear. With 30 days' notice, I could demand full repayment. Failure to pay meant asset seizure.
The restaurant. The equipment.
Everything. My hands trembled, not with fear, but with clarity. Gregory thought love made me harmless. He thought humiliation would make me compliant. He thought I'd quietly disappear. I picked up my phone and dialed the one person who knew exactly how dangerous I could be when pushed. My attorney answered on the second ring. And with one sentence, my husband's victory speech turned into a countdown. Gregory believed the worst thing he'd done was embarrass me in public. He had no idea the real damage began the moment I opened my laptop.
Are you absolutely certain?
My attorney's voice was calm, steady, but underneath it, I heard the weight of the question. She knew what I was asking. She also knew there was no undoing it once the process started. Yes, I said. My voice surprised me. It didn't waver. I want the loan recalled. Immediately. There was a pause on the line.
Not doubt. Calculation.
Once the notice is delivered, she said carefully, the business has 30 days. Without replacement funding, it won't survive. You understand that?
I do.
What I didn't say was this. He understood humiliation. Consequences were new to him.
When the call ended, I sat alone in my office, the house unnervingly quiet around me.
The divorce papers still sat unopened in the kitchen, but they no longer felt like a threat. They felt irrelevant. Gregory had assumed that ending the marriage meant ending my leverage. He was wrong. By morning, everything was in motion. Legal notices prepared. Timelines set. My attorney moved with the efficiency of someone who had spent years cleaning up messes left by overconfident men. At exactly 8 a.m., the recall notice was sent to the restaurant's official business address. Gregory would see it before lunch. I made coffee and sat on the back patio, watching the city wake up as if nothing monumental was about to collapse. Birds moved between fences. Cars passed in steady streams. The world didn't care that my marriage had imploded or that a luxury restaurant was now living on borrowed time. And somehow, that steadiness grounded me. At 9:17 a.m., my phone rang.
Gregory. Let it ring. At 9:19, it rang again.
By 9:30, there were 4 missed calls and 1 voicemail. I listened to it once. Joanna, I just got something from your lawyer. There's obviously been a mistake. Call me back. No apology. No concern. Just assumption. The next voicemail came an hour later. Sharper this time. Irritated. I don't know what you think you're doing, but this isn't funny.
You're overreacting. Overreacting.
By noon, the tone had changed again. Panic was starting to leak through the cracks. Investors are calling. We need to talk. Now. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I made a list. Change the locks. Move important documents to a secure location. Separate accounts. Schedule therapy. Call Fiona. Each task was small, manageable. Anchors in a moment that could have easily spun out of control. When I called the locksmith, my voice didn't shake. When I scheduled an emergency therapy appointment, I didn't cry.
He was functioning on something stronger than adrenaline.
Clarity. Gregory called 12 times that day. Then 18. Then left a voicemail I almost didn't listen to. Please, he said, his voice quieter now. You didn't mean what you said last night. I didn't mean it either. We can fix this. I laughed. Out loud. Not because it was funny, but because it was revealing. He still thought this was about emotions. About forgiveness. About me calming down and putting things back the way they were. He still thought I existed to stabilize his world. By evening, my attorney called with an update. 2 investors have already reached out, she said. They're nervous.
Word travels fast.
I pictured Gregory pacing his office, phone pressed to his ear, realizing for the first time that confidence doesn't replace capital. That charm doesn't cover debt. That the woman he'd dismissed as decorative was the foundation he'd been standing on. That night, I slept, really slept, for the first time in weeks. When I woke the next morning, my phone showed 42 missed calls. I turned it face down and made breakfast. Because whatever Gregory was about to lose, I had already taken back something far more valuable. Control. He thought pulling away from me would leave him free. What it really did was expose just how much of his empire was built in my name. By the 3rd day, Gregory stopped calling like a husband and started calling like a man in free fall. The voicemails blurred together, confusion melting into anger, anger collapsing into bargaining. Each message followed the same pattern. Denial first, then accusation, then panic. It was almost educational, listening to someone experience consequences in real time. You're destroying everything we built together, he said in one message, his voice hoarse. Everything you built, I corrected quietly to an empty kitchen. By midweek, he escalated. He showed up at the house. I watched from the upstairs window as his car pulled into the driveway like it still belonged there. He stepped out wearing the same suit he'd worn to the grand opening. Now wrinkled, dulled, exhausted.
He knocked once.
Then again. Then pounded. Joanna, he shouted. We need to talk. I didn't move. This house was in my name. Purchased before our marriage. Paid for with money he'd never earned and never asked about. He had walked through it for years like it was his kingdom. Now it was just a locked door. Eventually, he left. An hour later, he came back with flowers. That was the moment I called the police. I didn't do it out of spite. I did it out of documentation. My attorney had been very clear. Patterns matter.
Boundaries matter.
And men like Gregory didn't suddenly become respectful just because the power dynamic shifted. When the officers escorted him away, he looked stunned. Not angry, not dramatic. Just genuinely confused. As if no one had ever told him no before. That night, I finally cried. Not over Gregory, but over myself. Over the years I'd spent smoothing things over. Shrinking reactions. Reframing disrespect as stress. Love had made me patient. It had also made me quiet in moments when I should have been loud. I promised myself that wouldn't happen again. The fallout at the restaurant accelerated faster than even my attorney predicted. Vendors began demanding immediate payment. Equipment leases were suddenly under scrutiny. Investors, once drunk on optimism and champagne, started calling lawyers instead. Gregory tried everything. He begged. He blamed. He told people I was unstable. Then he told them I was vindictive. Then, when that didn't work, he told them I was cold. That one made me smile. Cold meant unmoved.
Unreachable.
No longer controllable. On day 6, his mother called me. Her voice cracked with desperation, tears spilling through the phone as she begged me to be reasonable. She talked about his childhood. His pressure. His stress. She never mentioned what he'd done to me. I listened politely. Then I said one sentence. He humiliated me publicly and served me divorce papers in front of strangers.
Silence.
She never called again. I met my attorney in person that Friday. Her office smelled like coffee and paper and competence. She slid a stack of documents across the desk, updated filings, financial summaries, and one particularly satisfying report. 2 lawsuits have already been filed against him, she said.
Misrepresentation.
Breach of trust. I nodded.
And a loan.
Proceeding exactly as written. He hasn't made a single payment attempt. Of course he hadn't. Gregory didn't plan for repayment. He planned for entitlement. Before I left, she looked at me carefully. I need to ask, are you okay? I thought about it. I was tired. I was bruised. But I wasn't lost. I'm clearer than I've been in years, I said. That weekend, my best friend Fiona flew home early from a work trip. She took one look at me and wrapped me in a hug so tight it knocked the air out of my lungs. You're not crazy, she said immediately.
I need you to hear that.
I did. Because the world has a way of making women doubt themselves the moment they stop absorbing damage quietly. Gregory lost investors that same weekend. Big ones.
The kind who don't come back.
The kind who remember betrayal longer than ambition. His restaurant, the one he'd toasted so confidently, was now hemorrhaging money before it ever had a chance to stabilize. And for the first time since that night, I felt something unexpected. Peace. Not because he was suffering, but because I was no longer protecting him from himself. Gregory thought the worst was over once I stopped answering his calls. He didn't know the real reckoning hadn't even started yet. The silence after chaos is unsettling. Once Gregory stopped showing up and the calls slowed from frantic to sporadic, I expected relief. Instead, what settled over my life felt unfamiliar. Too quiet, too open. There was no one to manage, no moods to anticipate, no reputation to protect that wasn't my own. For the first time in 4 years, my thoughts were uninterrupted. That was when the guilt tried to sneak in. It arrived disguised as concern. For the staff at the restaurant. For the chefs who'd worked overtime. For the servers who depended on tips and optimism. I told myself I was hurting people who hadn't done anything wrong, and that narrative almost worked. Almost. But then I reminded myself of something important. Gregory had options. He always had. He could sell assets. He could bring in new partners. He could take responsibility. What he couldn't do anymore was assume I would quietly absorb the fallout of his choices. That was the difference. I wasn't destroying his business. I was withdrawing my support. And there's nothing cruel about refusing to bankroll disrespect. A week after the recall notice, my attorney called with another update. He's trying to secure emergency funding, she said.
Private lenders. High interest.
Bad terms. I pictured Gregory sitting across from people he once would have dismissed, suddenly desperate enough to accept whatever scraps they offered. The irony wasn't lost on me. Will it work? I asked. Unlikely. Even if he gets the money, the damage to his credibility is already done. Credibility. That was the word Gregory never protected, because he assumed charm could replace it. Meanwhile, my life was quietly reorganizing itself. I changed the locks. Moved my important documents into a safety deposit box. Updated beneficiaries. Separated accounts that should have been separate all along. Each action felt small but powerful, like reclaiming square inches of myself I'd unknowingly surrendered. I also started therapy. In the first session, my therapist asked a question that stopped me cold. When did you start believing that being understanding meant being invisible? I didn't have an answer. Not immediately. But I thought about it for days. About how often I'd softened my reactions so Gregory wouldn't feel challenged. How frequently I'd downplayed my intelligence so he could feel impressive. How easily I'd stepped back so he could step forward. Love, I'd learned, can quietly become a performance. Gregory resurfaced again on day 12. Not in person. Not by phone. He sent an email. It was long. Rambling. Emotional. He apologized. Sort of. Took responsibility. Selectively. He blamed stress. Pressure. Alcohol. Success. Anything that wasn't himself. I never meant to hurt you, he wrote. I just didn't realize how much I depended on you until you were gone. That sentence told me everything. Not loved.
Not respected.
Depended on. I didn't reply. Instead, I forwarded the email to my attorney and went for a walk. The city felt different now. Lighter. Like I was moving through it as myself rather than as someone's extension. I noticed things I'd ignored before. Cafes I wanted to try, streets I'd never taken, conversations I didn't have to rush through. That evening, Fiona and I sat on the couch with takeout containers between us. "Do you miss him?" she asked gently. I considered the question honestly. "I miss who I thought he was," I said. "But I don't miss shrinking." She nodded. That's the right answer. By the end of the second week, the rumors were everywhere.
Industry whispers. Investor side eyes.
The restaurant was no longer a triumph. It was a risk. A cautionary tale. A place people talked about in lowered voices. Gregory had built his identity around being admired. Now he was being analyzed. And that terrified him more than losing me ever could. He thought losing my money was his greatest fear. What he hadn't realized yet was how much worse it feels to lose your reputation. Slowly, publicly, and permanently. By the third week, Gregory stopped pretending this was a misunderstanding and started treating it like a war. That was when the messages shifted again. Not pleading this time, but calculated. He sent mutual friends to check on me. Old colleagues reached out under the excuse of concern, their questions carefully phrased, their curiosity poorly disguised. I could hear his voice in every interaction, still trying to control the narrative from behind the scenes. I declined to participate. Silence, I was learning, is not weakness. It is a boundary. My attorney, however, was very much not silent. She updated me regularly, her tone professional but increasingly sharp as Gregory's legal team made one weak request after another. "They're asking for extensions," she told me during one call. "Claiming temporary hardship." "Temporary?" I asked. She let out a dry laugh. "Only if you define temporary as catastrophic mismanagement." The restaurant's numbers were worse than expected. The grand opening buzz had evaporated, replaced by half-filled tables and whispered speculation. Vendors demanded payment up front. Staff turnover climbed. The magic Gregory had promised investors was gone, replaced by visible strain and an owner who no longer inspired confidence. And then came the first formal court filing. Gregory contested the loan recall. Not because he had legal grounds, but because he hoped intimidation might work where charm had failed. His filing painted me as vindictive, emotionally unstable, and retaliatory following marital discord. When my attorney showed me the document, I didn't feel angry. I felt embarrassed for him. "He's throwing everything at the wall," she said, hoping something sticks. "Will it?" I asked. She shook her head. "The contracts are airtight. Facts matter more than feelings in court." That night, I reread my grandmother's old journals. She'd kept them meticulously, documenting business deals, betrayals, recoveries. One line stood out, written in firm, slanted ink.
Never confuse kindness with surrender.
I had done that for years. I stopped doing it now. Gregory's next move surprised even my attorney. He requested a private meeting. No lawyers. No mediators.
Just the two of Stati Uniti.
"I think it's a bad idea," she said immediately. "But if you choose to go, document everything." I thought about it for a long time. Part of me wanted nothing to do with him. Another part, quieter but firm, wanted to look him in the eye. Not for closure.
Not for reconciliation.
For confirmation. I agreed to meet him at the house. My house. On my terms. He arrived early, pacing on the porch like a man waiting for judgment. He looked thinner. Older. The confidence that once filled every room with him now seemed borrowed, stretched thin. When I opened the door, he smiled instinctively, then caught himself. "Thank you for seeing me," he said. We sat in the living room, a careful distance between us. He launched into a speech almost immediately. Apologies layered with excuses. Regret mixed with resentment. He spoke as if the right arrangement of words might reset time. "I didn't think you'd actually do it," he admitted finally. "I thought you'd cool off." "There it is," I said calmly. He frowned. "What? You never thought I'd choose myself." The words landed harder than anything else I could have said. He tried again. Talked about memories. About what we'd meant to each other. About how hard things had gotten for him. For him. I let him finish. Then I stood. "This conversation isn't changing anything," I said. I didn't do this to punish you. I did it because I finally understood my value. His face tightened. So that's it?
You're just, don't?
I nodded. I was done the moment you decided I was disposable. He left shortly after, quieter than he arrived. And as I closed the door behind him, I realized something profound. I didn't feel victorious. I felt free. I thought that meeting him would be the hardest part. I was wrong. The hardest part was realizing I'd outgrown the man who once felt larger than my life. After Gregory left that night, I walked through the house slowly, as if seeing it for the first time. The rooms felt different. Not emptier, just quieter. Honest. For years, I had arranged my life around someone else's comfort, someone else's schedule, someone else's ego. Now there was space. And space, I was learning, can be unsettling before it becomes liberating. The next morning, the legal momentum accelerated. My attorney called before I'd finished my coffee. He's running out of time, she said. And options. Gregory's attempt to contest the loan recall had failed. Predictably. Contracts don't bend because someone regrets signing them. The 30-day clock was still ticking, and with every passing hour, the restaurant situation worsened. 2 more investors pulled out. One demanded his money back publicly. That was when the narrative fully slipped out of Gregory's control. The industry chatter turned sharp. People who once toasted his vision now questioned his competence. Articles didn't need to be written. Reputations don't require headlines to collapse. All it takes is enough people deciding to stop believing. Gregory tried to believe harder. He gave interviews. Spoke about temporary setbacks. Claimed the funding shift was part of a strategic restructure. Anyone who knew business could hear the lie underneath the polish. Meanwhile, I was doing something radical. I was rebuilding myself. I returned to routines I'd abandoned, early morning walks, quiet breakfasts, reading for pleasure instead of optics. I cleaned out closets filled with clothes chosen to fit an image rather than a personality. I donated things that no longer felt like mine. Each item gone felt like breathing deeper. Fiona stayed with me most evenings. We talked about everything and nothing. Work, childhood memories, stupid movies we loved. She never rushed me to move on, never tried to spin silver linings. She let the process be messy. One evening she asked, "What scares you most right now?" I didn't answer immediately. Then I said, "That I'll forget this feeling. That I'll convince myself it wasn't that bad." She nodded.
Write it down.
So I did. I wrote about the restaurant.
The word rusty.
The envelope.
The silence of the room waiting for me to break.
I wrote about how small I'd felt, and how dangerous that smallness had been.
I promised myself I'd never rewrite that memory to protect someone else again.
Gregory resurfaced indirectly a few days later. A mutual acquaintance called, awkward and hesitant. "He's not doing well," they said. "He says you're being unfair." Unfair. I thanked them for the update and changed the subject. Fairness had never been his concern when he believed he held all the power. By the 4th week, the reality became unavoidable. He couldn't pay.
The restaurant defaulted on multiple obligations.
Equipment vendors began reclaiming assets. Staff were laid off in waves. The space that once hosted champagne and speeches now echoed with unfinished business and regret. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I mourned, quietly, not for Gregory, but for the version of myself who believed love required endurance at any cost. The court date for the divorce was scheduled soon after. Gregory's legal team pushed for settlements that still favored him, still assumed I'd compromise to keep the peace. I didn't. My attorney handled it with surgical precision. Every number documented.
Every asset traced.
Every assumption corrected. Gregory finally understood something he should have known all along. I wasn't reacting. I was acting. And that difference changed everything. He thought the collapse of his business would be the lowest point. What he didn't see coming was how much harder it is to face a woman who no longer needs his approval. The divorce hearing arrived faster than I expected. Not because the process was rushed, but because time feels different when you stop waiting for someone else to decide your future. Weeks that once dragged now moved with purpose. Every document filed, every meeting held, felt like another knot loosening. Gregory walked into the courthouse looking like a man trying to borrow confidence he no longer owned. His suit was tailored, his posture practiced, but something essential was missing.
The easy arrogance.
The assumption that things would work out because they always had. He avoided my eyes, then overcorrected and smiled like we were still playing a role. I didn't smile back. The hearing itself was clinical. Numbers. Dates. Agreements.
No room for charm.
No space for rewriting history. The judge asked questions. My attorney answered with facts. Gregory's attorney tried framing, then pivoted to emotion when framing failed. It didn't help. When the loan recall was mentioned, Gregory stiffened. When the prenuptial agreement surfaced, his shoulders dropped. I watched realization spread across his face. Not anger, not outrage, but disbelief. He truly hadn't thought I'd planned ahead. That hurt him more than losing money ever could. After the hearing, he approached me in the hallway. His voice was low, urgent, like we were conspiring rather than ending. You didn't have to make this public, he said. You could have handled this quietly. I met his gaze. So could you. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. For once, there was nothing he could say that would reshape the outcome. The divorce was finalized 2 weeks later. Clean.
Decisive. Final.
I walked out of the courthouse lighter than I'd felt in years. Not because I'd won, but because I'd stopped pretending. I wasn't someone's wife anymore. I wasn't someone's investor. I wasn't someone's safety net. I was just me. The restaurant closed shortly after. 3 months from grand opening to locked doors. A record, according to one article I didn't read but heard about through Fiona. Equipment was auctioned. The space went dark. Gregory's name became shorthand for miscalculation. People stopped calling to check in. Once it was clear there was nothing left to salvage. That silence felt different too. Peaceful. I made changes, not dramatic ones but meaningful ones.
I sold the house and bought something smaller, quieter.
A place that felt like shelter instead of a stage. I invested my money carefully this time, with people who didn't confuse entitlement with vision. I started mentoring young women entering finance. Not with speeches but with honesty. I told them about contracts. Boundaries. The cost of ignoring discomfort because it's inconvenient. One of them asked me once, "Do you regret trusting him?" I thought about it. "No," I said. "I regret trusting him more than I trusted myself." That distinction mattered. Months passed. Then a year. Gregory faded into background noise. Occasional updates filtered through mutual connections. New city, new attempts, smaller ambitions.
Nothing stuck.
Confidence without accountability doesn't age well. Sometimes, late at night, I'd think about that word again.
Rusty.
And I'd smile. Rust happens when something is left unused, neglected, exposed without care. What Gregory mistook for decay was actually restraint. What he saw as weakness was patience. What he dismissed as decoration was discipline. I hadn't corroded. I had endured. And when the pressure finally came, I didn't break. I revealed what was underneath. He thought the story ended when the restaurant closed. But the truth is, the real ending only makes sense once you understand what I became after he walked away. 2 years have passed since that night. Time didn't erase what happened, but it did something better. It gave it context. Distance has a way of stripping moments down to their truth, separating pain from meaning. And now when I think back to the restaurant, the laughter, the word that cut through me like glass, I don't feel rage. I feel clarity. The woman I was that night believed endurance was the same as strength. She believed loyalty could compensate for imbalance. She thought love meant staying quiet when something felt wrong. She was wrong. I see her now, not with shame, but with compassion. She did the best she could with what she understood at the time. And when the truth finally arrived, she didn't collapse. She adapted. After the divorce, life didn't magically become perfect. Healing never works that way. There were mornings when the quiet felt heavy, when I reached for my phone out of habit, expecting a message that no longer mattered. There were evenings when I questioned whether I'd been too harsh, too decisive, too unforgiving. Then I remembered the envelope. The audience. The way humiliation had been offered like entertainment. And the doubt dissolved. I rebuilt slowly, deliberately. I chose projects that aligned with my values instead of my image. I invested in businesses run by people who didn't confuse ambition with entitlement. I said no more often, and discovered that no is a complete sentence. The mentorship program grew. The young women I worked with reminded me of myself before I learned to shrink. Smart. Driven. Careful in all the wrong places. I taught them how to read contracts like stories, how to spot red flags disguised as charm, how to trust discomfort without waiting for disaster to validate it. One of them once asked, "How did you know when it was time to stop forgiving?" I answered honestly. When forgiveness started costing me my dignity.
Gregory crossed my mind less and less.
When he did, it wasn't with bitterness, but with understanding. He wasn't uniquely cruel. He was simply accustomed to a world that rewarded confidence more than character. A world where women were expected to absorb damage quietly so men could continue uninterrupted. I had stepped out of that expectation. And that changed everything. A year after the divorce, I ran into one of the investors from the grand opening. We were standing in line at a coffee shop, and recognition flickered across her face. "I always wondered," she said carefully.
Did you plan it?
That night.
I shook my head.
No. I just stopped protecting him. She smiled. Not kindly, but knowingly. That's usually all it takes. That moment stayed with me. Power isn't always loud. Sometimes it's simply the refusal to participate in your own erasure. I don't tell this story because I'm proud of Gregory's downfall. I'm not. His choices were his own, and their consequences followed naturally. What I'm proud of is this. I didn't let someone else's contempt become my identity. I didn't negotiate my worth. I didn't beg for respect. I chose myself, not dramatically, not perfectly, but decisively. And that decision continues to pay dividends no investment ever could. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. People will call you cold the moment you stop being useful to them. They will label you difficult when you stop being convenient. They will accuse you of cruelty when you refuse to bleed quietly. Let them. Because strength doesn't always look like resilience. Sometimes it looks like walking away and refusing to explain. If you think this story is about revenge, you've missed the point. The real lesson only becomes clear once you understand what happens after a woman stops asking for permission. There's a strange myth people like to believe about women who walk away. They imagine rage,
Pettiness.
a need to win.
They picture scorched earth and sleepless nights fueled by bitterness.
It makes the story easier to digest, because if a woman leaves calmly, deliberately, without begging, then the narrative falls apart. What they never expect is peace. Not immediately. Not cleanly. But steadily. After everything was finalized, after the last signature dried and the last legal call ended, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt quiet. Like the noise I'd lived with for years had finally shut off.
No constant evaluation. No performance.
No measuring myself against someone else's expectations. Just space. That space forced me to confront something uncomfortable. I didn't actually know what I wanted anymore. I'd spent so long supporting Gregory's ambitions that my own preferences had become background noise. Choices that should have been simple, where to live, how to spend weekends, what success looked like, suddenly required intention. So I started small. I said yes to things that felt grounding. Long walks.
Early mornings.
Evenings with no agenda. I stopped explaining my decisions to people who weren't affected by them. I stopped justifying why I didn't try harder to save something that had already been broken in public. People asked questions anyway.
Do you ever think you were too harsh?
Would you handle it differently now? Do you think he deserved that outcome? I learned to answer without defensiveness. He made choices. I responded to them. That answer made some people uncomfortable. It didn't assign blame theatrically. It didn't offer a villain monologue. It simply acknowledged cause and effect. Gregory's story, meanwhile, continued without me. Occasionally, I'd hear updates. Never directly, always filtered. New ventures that didn't last. Partnerships that dissolved quickly. A pattern repeating itself in different cities with different people. The details stopped mattering. Patterns don't require witnesses to exist. What mattered was what I was building instead. I expanded my investments slowly, intentionally. I chose founders who value transparency over bravado. I asked harder questions. I listened for defensiveness instead of confidence. Every decision became a reflection of what I'd learned the hard way. And I learned to trust myself again. That was the real work. Trusting your instincts after someone convinces you they're inconvenient is harder than leaving. It requires unlearning. It requires sitting with discomfort instead of smoothing it over. It requires resisting the urge to be easy, so others feel comfortable. I wasn't easy anymore. I was honest. One afternoon, while mentoring a group of young professionals, someone said something that stopped me cold. I'm afraid if I set boundaries, people won't like me. I smiled gently and said, some won't. But the ones who matter will adjust. That truth had cost me years to learn. Looking back, I understand why Gregory misjudged me. I had made myself palatable, predictable, safe. I had mistaken self-control for self-erasure and called it maturity. But strength doesn't come from how much you can endure. It comes from knowing when endurance becomes self-betrayal. The night Gregory called me rusty, he thought he was ending a chapter. He thought he was upgrading, moving forward, leaving something behind. In reality, he was giving me a mirror. And once I saw myself clearly, once I stopped negotiating my worth, the story could never go back to what it was. You might think the hardest part was walking away. But the real challenge came later, when I had to decide who I would become without anyone else defining me. There's a moment after upheaval that no one prepares you for. It's not the explosion. It's not the fallout. It's the quiet realization that no one is coming to tell you who to be next. After the divorce, after the business collapse, after the dust settled, I stood in that space, free but undefined. 4 years my identity had been contextual. Wife.
Partner support system. The reasonable one. The understanding one.
Those labels had shaped my decisions more than I realized. Without them, I had to answer a question I'd avoided for too long. Who am I when I'm not being chosen, or discarded, by someone else? At first, the answer felt unsteady. I tried on versions of myself the way people try on clothes after weight loss. Familiar shapes, wrong fit. I said yes to opportunities out of habit. I entertained conversations that drained me simply because I always had. Then something shifted. I stopped asking, does this make me agreeable? And started asking, does this make me feel grounded? That question changed everything. I pulled back from circles where my presence had always been conditional. I let go of relationships that required me to be smaller, softer, less. I stopped apologizing for being decisive, for being direct, for being unmoved by manipulation dressed up as charm. People noticed. Some admired it quietly. Some resented it openly. Some disappeared altogether. I let them.
One afternoon, I caught myself laughing alone in my kitchen. Really laughing, not the polite kind.
It startled me. Not because it was loud, but because it was unmonitored.
No one to impress.
No reaction to manage. That was when I understood. Joy feels different when it doesn't require permission. Gregory surfaced once more that year. Not in person, not directly. A mutual acquaintance mentioned he'd asked about me. Wanted to know how I was doing. Whether I was happy. The word felt ironic. Happiness had never been what I wanted. I wanted alignment. Peace. A sense of internal coherence I'd traded away for stability that wasn't stable at all. I was more than happy. I was solid. The work I did reflected that shift. I took on fewer projects, but better ones. I trusted my instincts again, even when they made others uncomfortable. I stopped over-explaining my choices to people who benefited from my doubt. When younger women asked me for advice, I didn't tell them to be fearless. I told them to be honest. Fear passes.
Honesty lingers.
I told them to watch how people react when they say no. To notice who respects it and who tries to negotiate it. To understand that discomfort is often the first sign you're telling the truth. I didn't become colder. I became clearer. And clarity has a way of revealing what was always there.
Looking back, I can see how Gregory confused my restraint for weakness.
How he mistook my patience for permission. How he believed my silence meant safety. For him. It didn't. It meant I was listening. And when I finally spoke, through action, not argument, the impact surprised us both. I don't hate him. Hatred requires investment. I simply outgrew the version of myself that would have stayed. That's the part people misunderstand. Leaving wasn't an act of anger. It was an act of recognition. People assume the story ends once you reclaim your power. But the truth is, the most important chapter begins when you realize you don't need to prove it to anyone. Recognition doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in fragments, quiet moments that sneak up on you when you're no longer bracing for impact. For me, it happened on an ordinary afternoon, standing in line at a grocery store, of all places. The cashier smiled and made small talk. I smiled back. No tension. No internal calculation. No wondering how I was being perceived.
Just presence.
I realized then how much energy I'd once spent anticipating reactions. Measuring tone. Softening edges. Predicting moods that weren't mine to manage. I'd called it awareness.
Emotional intelligence.
Maturity. In truth, it had been hypervigilance. And I was finally free from it. Life after Gregory didn't feel dramatic. It felt intentional. My days grew quieter but fuller. I stopped overloading my schedule to prove productivity. I left conversations when they turned dismissive instead of staying to repair something I hadn't broken. That change didn't go unnoticed. People responded differently when I stopped cushioning my boundaries. Some leaned in, respectful and curious. Others pushed back, unsettled by the absence of negotiation. A few accused me, half joking, half serious, of being intense now. I didn't argue. Intensity is often just what honesty looks like to people who benefited from your compliance. I thought about that often while mentoring. One woman confessed she was afraid to assert herself at work because she didn't want to be labeled difficult. I told her the truth I wish someone had told me earlier.
You don't get to control the label.
You only get to control the cost. The cost of silence is paid slowly, daily, quietly. Until one day you wake up and realize you've spent years underwriting someone else's comfort with your own erosion. I wasn't willing to pay that price again. Occasionally, curiosity tugged at me. Not about Gregory himself, but about the version of me who'd loved him so thoroughly. I wondered how she'd gotten lost in someone else's ambitions without noticing the slow displacement of her own. The answer was simple and uncomfortable. I'd been praised for it. For being supportive. For being adaptable. For not making things harder. I'd been rewarded for disappearing gracefully. But disappearing, no matter how politely, is still disappearing. Once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. I began rebuilding not just my routines, but my internal standards. I stopped asking whether something was reasonable and started asking whether it was respectful. I stopped seeking consensus where consent should have been enough. And slowly, a new confidence took root. Not loud.
Not performative.
Just steady. The kind that doesn't flinch when misunderstood. That confidence showed up in unexpected ways. I negotiated better. Walked away faster. Trusted silence as an answer. I didn't chase clarity from people who thrived on ambiguity.
I chose myself in small ways. Daily ways.
And those choices accumulated. One evening, as I was journaling, I wrote a sentence that made me pause. I am no longer afraid of being seen clearly. That fear had shaped so much of my past. Fear that clarity would cost me love, opportunity, belonging. But clarity didn't cost me those things. It filtered them. What remained was real. Grounded. Mine. I once thought reclaiming myself was about undoing the past. What I didn't expect was that it would quietly redefine every future choice I made. Redefining the future sounds dramatic, but in practice, it's subtle. It happens in the moments no one applauds. The emails you don't answer.
The meetings you decline.
The pause you allow yourself before saying yes out of habit. These were the places where my real transformation lived. Not in grand declarations, but in quiet refusals. I noticed it first in my work. I stopped chasing opportunities that looked impressive on paper but felt hollow in execution. I no longer mistook visibility for value. When people pitched ideas with more enthusiasm than integrity, I walked away without guilt. I trusted the discomfort that rose when something felt misaligned, instead of rationalizing it into silence. That trust was new. Before, I had overridden it repeatedly, telling myself I was being too sensitive, too cautious, too demanding. Now, I understood that sensitivity wasn't a flaw, it was information. And I had learned how to listen. Relationships shifted too. Some friendships deepened, strengthened by honesty and mutual respect. Others faded quietly when I stopped overextending myself to maintain them. There was grief in that, but also relief. I was no longer auditioning for connection. Connection either existed, or it didn't. One afternoon, I ran into an old acquaintance who hadn't seen me since before the divorce. After a few minutes of conversation, she tilted her head and said, "You seem different."
Calmer. Harder to read.
I smiled. "That's because I stopped explaining myself." She laughed, but I meant it. I'd realized that explanation can become a performance when it's rooted in fear. Fear of being misjudged.
Fear of being misunderstood.
Fear of being abandoned for standing too firmly in your own truth. I had lived there for years. Now, I let people draw their own conclusions. If they assumed I was distant, so be it. If they thought I was guarded, that was fine too. Guarded isn't closed. It's selective. And selection is a form of self-respect. Gregory didn't disappear from my thoughts entirely. Not because I missed him, but because he had been the catalyst. The fracture that exposed everything beneath it. Without that moment, the word, the envelope, the public dismissal, I might have stayed comfortable enough to keep shrinking. That realization didn't make me grateful for the pain. But it made me honest about its impact. I thought often about how easily confidence can turn into entitlement, how charm can camouflage control, how quickly a woman's support is reframed as obligation once it's expected instead of appreciated. I vowed never to confuse the two again. When people asked me what I'd learned, I resisted giving them neat answers. Growth isn't tidy. It doesn't resolve into slogans. But if I had to distill it into something simple, it would be this. Pay attention to who benefits when you doubt yourself. That awareness alone can change the course of a life. The future I was building didn't revolve around proving anything. It revolved around alignment.
With my values.
My energy.
My sense of self. It causes slower paths.
Quieter wins. Relationships rooted in reciprocity instead of endurance. And for the first time, I trusted that what was meant for me wouldn't require self-erasure as an entry fee. That trust felt radical. Liberating. Earned. I once believed growth meant becoming more agreeable, more flexible, more forgiving. What I know now is that real growth begins the moment you stop abandoning yourself to keep the peace. Peace, I discovered, is not passive. It doesn't arrive because conflict disappears. It arrives because you stop negotiating with what harms you. That distinction mattered more than anything else I learned. By the time a year and a half had passed, my life no longer felt like a recovery. It felt like a direction. I wasn't rebuilding something that had broken. I was building something that had never existed before. A life that didn't require constant adjustment to someone else's expectations. The absence of chaos revealed something unexpected. Capacity. I had more mental space. More patience. More creativity. When I wasn't managing Gregory's moods, his image, his ambitions, I had room to imagine things beyond survival. I started projects I'd once dismissed as not practical enough. I traveled without checking in. I made decisions without rehearsing how I'd explain them. Freedom, I learned, is quiet at first. It whispers before it roars. One evening, while sorting through old files, I found a photo from the restaurant's grand opening. Gregory stood at the center, glass raised, confidence sharpened into performance. I stood beside him, smiling, composed, already halfway gone without knowing it. I didn't feel sadness looking at it. I felt distance. The woman in that photo had been trying to be chosen by someone who was already planning his exit. She didn't know it yet, but she had outgrown the role long before the curtain dropped. I deleted the photo. Not out of bitterness, but because it no longer represented me. People often asked if I felt vindicated knowing how things turned out for Gregory. The question always carried a hint of expectation, like I was supposed to admit satisfaction in his unraveling. But vindication implies competition. I wasn't competing with him. I had left the arena entirely. Gregory's life continued in fits and starts, according to the occasional updates that drifted my way. New job.
New city.
New attempts at reinvention. Each one smaller, quieter, less convincing than the last. Not because he lacked talent, but because he never learned accountability. That lesson isn't transferable. It has to be lived. As for me, the confidence I'd built wasn't flashy. It didn't announce itself. It showed up in boundaries that didn't require reinforcement. In decisions that didn't need applause. In relationships that didn't feel transactional. I stopped being impressed by intensity and started valuing consistency. That changed the people I allowed close. I also stopped fearing being alone. Loneliness had once kept me tethered to situations that drained me. Now, solitude felt restorative. It was where I processed, recalibrated, listened to myself without interruption. I didn't rush to fill it. I honored it. One night, journaling by lamplight, I wrote something that made me pause. I no longer confuse love with tolerance. That line felt like closure. Not the dramatic kind, but the kind that seals something permanently.
He wasn't angry anymore.
I wasn't defensive. I didn't need Gregory to understand what he'd lost. I understood what I'd gained. And that was enough. You might think the story ends once peace is found. But the final lesson only reveals itself when you realize how easily peace can be taken, if you don't learn how to protect it. Protecting peace became my final education. Not in how to defend it loudly, but in how to recognize the moment it's being threatened. Peace rarely disappears all at once.
It erodes when you ignore small discomforts.
When you explain away disrespect. When you convince yourself that being understanding is the same as being safe. I had done that once. I would not do it again. The greatest shift wasn't external. It was internal. I no longer needed certainty from other people to trust my own judgment. I didn't wait for situations to become unbearable before walking away. I listened the first time something felt wrong. That changed everything. Opportunities no longer dazzled me just because they looked impressive. People no longer earned my loyalty simply by wanting access to me. I watched behavior more than words. I noticed who respected boundaries without resentment, and who treated them like obstacles to overcome. That awareness became my compass. I stopped romanticizing potential. In people. In partnerships. In promises. Potential without follow-through is just another form of delay. And I had wasted enough time waiting for someone to become who they claimed to be. Life simplified itself after that. Not smaller. Cleaner. I invested my energy where it was reciprocated. I built relationships that didn't require endurance as proof of love. I allowed myself to be fully seen without adjusting the lighting so others could look better. And here's the truth no one talks about enough. When you stop betraying yourself, some people will feel exposed. They'll call you distant. They'll say you've changed. They'll accuse you of being cold. Those accusations used to scare me. Now they inform me. Because cold is what people call clarity when it no longer serves them. I don't regret the way my marriage ended. I regret the years I spent mistaking restraint for virtue while slowly disappearing. I regret the moments I ignored my instincts because being agreeable felt safer than being honest. But regret isn't a place I live anymore. It's just a marker on the map. Proof of where I've been and why I don't return. If I could speak to the woman I was that night, the one standing in the restaurant, smiling through humiliation, I wouldn't tell her to be stronger. She already was. I wouldn't tell her to fight harder. She didn't need to. I would tell her this. You don't have to prove your worth to people who benefit from doubting it. You don't have to stay quiet to be loved. And you don't have to wait for permission to leave.
Walking away doesn't make you cruel.
It makes you honest. The story people remember will never be fully in your control. Some will say you overreacted. Others will say you were calculating. A few will understand without explanation. Let them choose. Your job is not to manage the narrative. Your job is to protect your life. Gregory once believed he could discard me and continue uninterrupted. He believed my value expired when my usefulness did. He believed silence meant safety. He was wrong. Because the moment I stopped absorbing damage quietly, everything changed. Not for him. For me.